Just until I find my own place, Mom, Marcus had promised, standing in Dorothy's doorway with 2 garbage bags and a cocky smile. By day 14, he'd taken over her kitchen, her living room, and her peace of mind. His girlfriend called Dorothy unreasonable. Dorothy called a locksmith. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from in the comments below. It reminds me that these stories don't echo into silence. They land somewhere real. Drop your location and don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sun filtered through the hand-stitched lace curtains of Dorothy Chen's modest ranch home on Maple Ridge Drive when she heard the familiar rumble of Marcus's pickup truck pulling into her carefully maintained driveway. The sound was unmistakable. That diesel engine with the slight knock she'd been telling him to fix for 3 years, the same truck that appeared in her driveway only when Marcus needed something. At 70, Dorothy had earned her quiet Saturday afternoons. Earl Grey tea with a dollop of local honey from Brennan's farm stand, the weekend crossword puzzles spread across her oak dining table, and the gentle hum of her well-maintained home settling around her like a comfortable cashmere shawl. She set down her ceramic mug, the one with tiny hand-painted violets dancing around the rim, a gift from her late husband Edmund on their 25th wedding anniversary, and walked to the front window. Through the pristine glass that she cleaned every Tuesday without fail using the same vinegar solution her mother had taught her 50 years ago, she watched Marcus climb the porch steps with the same casual swagger he'd carried since adolescence. 2 black garbage bags were slung over his shoulder, bulging with what appeared to be his entire life's possessions, and the sight made Dorothy's heart perform that familiar little skip it always did when Marcus appeared unexpectedly. Part maternal worry, part weary resignation, part unconditional love that she couldn't shake despite decades of disappointment. At 45, her only child still moved through the world like consequences were suggestions rather than certainties. His brown hair, once thick and unruly like his father's, had thinned considerably at the crown, and there were deep lines around his eyes that spoke of too many late nights, too much stress, and too many questionable decisions. He wore the same type of clothes he'd favored since high school, faded jeans with strategic holes, work boots that had seen better days, and a flannel shirt that hung loose on his increasingly narrow frame. Dorothy's neighborhood of Maple Ridge had always been a sanctuary for her. Tree-lined streets where children still rode bicycles and neighbors still waved from their porches. The houses were modest but well-maintained, built in the 1960s when families stayed put for generations. Her own ranch-style home, painted a soft butter yellow with white trim, sat on a corner lot that Edmund had chosen specifically for the mature oak tree in the front yard and the extra space for Dorothy's beloved flower garden. "Hey, Ma," Marcus called through the screen door, his voice carrying that same boyish charm that had gotten him out of trouble for decades. Without waiting for permission, a habit that should have warned him of what was coming, he pushed open the door and stepped into her immaculate foyer. The screen door slammed behind him with a sharp crack that made Dorothy wince. She'd asked him dozens of times over the years to be gentle with that door, but the request seemed to evaporate from his memory the moment he walked away. "Marcus," Dorothy's voice carried a note of cautious warmth, the kind reserved for stray cats who might bite, or beloved children who definitely would disappoint you. "I wasn't expecting you." He dropped the garbage bags with a soft thud onto her pristine hardwood floors she'd had professionally refinished just last spring after saving for 2 years to afford the work. The sound echoed through the house like a small earthquake, disturbing the careful order she'd spent decades perfecting. Dorothy had chosen those floors herself, a warm, honey-colored oak that complemented the antique furniture Edmund had inherited from his grandmother. Every scratch, every scuff mark was carefully monitored and immediately addressed. The sight of those bulging garbage bags sitting directly on the wood made her stomach clench involuntarily. "Yeah, well, life's been throwing curveballs lately." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Dorothy recognized from every time he'd gotten in trouble as a kid. From the broken window at age 8, when he insisted the ball had slipped, to the dented car at 16, when he sworn the pole had jumped out at him, to the bounced checks at 32 when the bank had made a mistake, that same sheepish neck rub preceded every request for help, every explanation that didn't quite add up. Dorothy's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the curtain, the delicate fabric soft between her weathered hands. These were hands that had changed 1,000 diapers, graded countless papers, held Edmund's hand through his final illness, and maintained this house through sheer force of will and careful budgeting. What's happened to your apartment in Riverside Heights? Landlord sold the building out from under us. Whole place is getting torn down for some fancy luxury condos with names like the Metropolitan or some garbage like that. Marcus shrugged like it was no big deal, but Dorothy caught the flash of something desperate flickering behind his brown eyes, eyes that once looked at her with such trust and affection before life had taught him that charm could substitute for responsibility and promises were things you made when you needed something.
Dorothy had heard this story before, or variations of it. The landlord who was unreasonable, the boss who was unfair, the girlfriend who was crazy, the system that was rigged against people like Marcus. In her son's version of events, he was always the victim of circumstances beyond his control, never the architect of his own misfortune. "When did this happen?" Dorothy asked, her voice taking on the careful tone she'd perfected during 30 years of teaching 3rd grade at Willowbrook Elementary. It was the same tone she'd used with children who claimed their homework had been eaten by their dog or their permission slips had spontaneously combusted. "Couple weeks ago. Been staying with friends, bouncing around." Marcus wandered into her living room without invitation, his work boots leaving faint marks on the carpet she'd vacuumed just that morning. The carpet was Dorothy's pride, a deep sage green that she'd chosen to complement the cream-colored walls and the antique furniture that filled the space. Every piece in the room had a story, a history, a reason for being exactly where it was. The sofa where Marcus now stood had been Edmund's favorite spot for watching Sunday football. The coffee table was hand-carved walnut that Edmund had crafted in his garage over the course of 6 months, working on it every evening after dinner until it was perfect. The bookshelf held first editions Dorothy had collected over decades of careful shopping at estate sales and antique stores. The mantelpiece displayed family photos spanning 3 generations, each one carefully dusted and positioned just so. "So, you need," Dorothy prompted, though she already knew the answer. She'd been down this road before. The urgent phone calls about overdue rent, the borrowed money that was never repaid, the promises to do better that lasted exactly until the next crisis arose. "Just a place to crash for a bit, just until I get back on my feet?" Marcus's grin widened, that lopsided smile that had melted her resolve 1,000 times before. It was the same smile he'd used to convince her to let him stay up past bedtime, to get out of doing chores, to borrow the car when he was 16 and barely had his license. "I've got a lead on a really nice place across town in Maplewood Heights. 2 bedrooms, decent rent, near the bus line. Perfect setup." Maplewood Heights was the newer development about 20 minutes away where young professionals lived in apartment complexes named like The Reserve and Pinnacle Point. Dorothy had driven through there once and been overwhelmed by the sheer sameness of it all. Identical buildings, identical landscaping, identical lives. "And the deposit?" Dorothy asked, because she knew Marcus well enough to know there was always something, some small detail that made everything more complicated than it first appeared. Marcus's smile flickered slightly. "Well, that's the thing. They want first month, last month, and security deposit up front. It's a chunk of change, but once I get settled in the new job—" "What new job?" Dorothy interrupted. "I've got an interview Monday morning, construction foreman position with Hartley Brothers Development, really solid company, great benefits. The guy who recommended me says it's basically a sure thing." Dorothy nodded, filing away this information with all the other sure things Marcus had told her about over the years. The restaurant job that was going to lead to management, the sales position that came with a company car, the business opportunity that just needed a small investment to get started. Before Dorothy could process this information fully, car door slammed outside with the sharp finality of an exclamation point. Through her window, she watched a young woman with platinum blonde hair emerge from a battered Honda Civic that was missing its front bumper and had a spiderweb crack across the passenger side windshield. The woman, girl really, she couldn't be older than 25, was wrestling a hot pink suitcase from the back seat, along with what appeared to be several shopping bags from discount stores. The sight of that battered Honda in her driveway made Dorothy's chest tighten. Her neighborhood was quiet, orderly, the kind of place where cars were maintained and lawns were mowed and people took pride in appearances. That beat-up Honda stood out like a neon sign advertising chaos. Dorothy's mouth dried. Marcus? Who is that? Oh, he added as if it were a casual afterthought. I hope you don't mind, but Amber's coming too. She's my girlfriend. Really sweet girl. You'll love her once you get to know her. She's been having a rough time lately too. The word girlfriend hit Dorothy like a small meteorite. She'd envisioned maybe helping her son through a rough patch, letting him sleep on the pull-out couch in her den for a few nights while he sorted out his life. She'd pictured quiet conversations over morning coffee, maybe even the chance to reconnect with the boy she'd raised, to understand how he'd become this man who drifted from crisis to crisis like a leaf on the wind. But this was something entirely different. This was two strangers moving into her carefully ordered life, bringing their chaos and their problems and their very different way of being in the world. Amber bounced up the front steps, her stiletto heels clicking against the wood like castanets. Each step left tiny dents in the porch boards that her late husband had lovingly stained and sealed just 5 years before his heart attack. The sound made Dorothy's teeth ache, not just the physical noise, but what it represented: carelessness, disregard for the work and love that had gone into creating something beautiful.
Mrs. Chen! Oh my gosh, hi! Amber's voice was bright and breathy, like a children's television host who'd had too much caffeine. Marcus has told me so much about you. Thank you so much for letting us stay. This is such a cute little house. It's like something from a magazine, like vintage chic or whatever. Dorothy managed a thin smile, the kind she'd perfected for difficult parent-teacher conferences when parents insisted their precious children could do no wrong despite evidence to the contrary. It's Miss Chen, actually. I never remarried after Marcus's father passed. Oh, sorry, Miss Chen. She giggled, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. I love your decorations. So vintage. And this carpet is so lived in. It has character. Marcus shot Amber a look that Dorothy pretended not to notice, but she caught it anyway. That quick, warning glance that said, "Be careful what you say." It was the same look he'd given his high school friends when they'd made jokes about Dorothy's house being old-fashioned or her rules being too strict. What Amber means is that the house has character. Real homey, Ma, Marcus said, his voice taking on that false heartiness that meant he was trying to smooth over something uncomfortable. Dorothy watched as Amber kicked off her heels in the middle of the living room, leaving them splayed across the carpet like fallen soldiers. The shoes were cheap imitations of designer styles, with scuffed soles and worn heels that spoke of long nights in places Dorothy couldn't imagine. Then, Amber proceeded to flop down on Dorothy's pristine sage green sofa, the one she'd saved for 6 months to buy from Henderson Antique Shop downtown, and immediately propped her bare feet up on the coffee table. The coffee table, the hand-carved walnut coffee table that Edmund had made for her 40th birthday, spending weeks in the garage crafting every detail with his own hands. The table that she polished every Sunday with lemon oil and treated like the treasure it was. The table that had never, in 27 years, had anyone's feet on it. Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach, like swallowing ice water too quickly. The sight of those bare feet, toenails painted electric blue with chips in the polish, resting on Edmund's handiwork, made her feel physically ill. So, Amber said, stretching like a cat in a sunbeam and making herself even more comfortable, "What's the Wi-Fi password? And do you have any snacks? I'm absolutely starving. We haven't eaten since like noon, and I get super cranky when my blood sugar drops." Dorothy glanced at the antique clock on the mantelpiece, a wedding gift from Edmund's parents that had kept perfect time for 47 years. It was 3:47 in the afternoon. "The Wi-Fi password is written on a card by the phone in the kitchen," Dorothy heard herself saying, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "And I think I have some crackers." "Oh, crackers are so boring. Don't you have any cookies or chips or anything fun? Marcus said you're like the best cook ever." Dorothy felt a flush of pride despite herself. She was a good cook, had learned from her mother and grandmother, women who understood that food was love made tangible. Her kitchen was her sanctuary, the place where she created comfort for herself and others. The idea of sharing that space, those skills, with someone who called crackers boring made her stomach clench.
Standing there in her own living room, watching the stranger make herself comfortable on furniture that held 47 years of memories, Dorothy felt suddenly displaced in her own home. The air seemed different somehow, charged with an energy that didn't belong, thick with the scent of cheap perfume and the underlying smell of cigarettes that clung to Amber's clothes. "Ma?" Marcus was looking at her with raised eyebrows, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to give. His expression was part hope, part expectation, part the same entitlement that had characterized their relationship for years. He wasn't asking for her help anymore. He was assuming it, the way he'd assumed she'd always be there to clean up his messes and smooth over his problems. Dorothy raced through decades of memories. Marcus as a toddler, clinging to her legs when she tried to leave him at daycare. Marcus at 8, bringing her dandelions he'd picked from the neighbor's yard because he thought they were prettier than roses. Marcus at 16, sullen and angry, but still crawling into her bed during thunderstorms when he thought she was asleep. Marcus at 25, calling her in tears when his first serious relationship ended, needing her to tell him he was lovable and worthy and going to be okay. He was her son, her only child, the baby she carried for 9 months and raised through scraped knees and teenage rebellion and young adult mistakes. When Edmund died 3 years ago, Marcus cried at the funeral and promised to visit more often, to take better care of her, to be the son she deserved. The visits lasted about 2 months before tapering off to holiday phone calls and birthday cards that arrived a week late. But he was still her son, the only family she had left in the world. And despite everything, despite the borrowed money that was never repaid, the broken promises, the years of worry, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. Not when he was standing in her living room looking simultaneously defiant and vulnerable, like the little boy who used to crawl into her bed during thunderstorms.
Temporarily, Dorothy repeated slowly, the word feeling heavy and foreign on her tongue, like speaking a language she'd never quite mastered. Absolutely, Marcus grinned, and the relief that flooded his face was so genuine that Dorothy felt her resolve weaken further. Just temporarily. You won't even know we're here. We'll be quiet as mice, I promise. And we'll help out around the house, won't we, Amber? Amber looked up from her examination of the remote control she'd somehow located. Oh, totally. I love cleaning. It's like therapeutic or whatever. The idea of Amber cleaning Dorothy's house was both laughable and terrifying. Dorothy had a system for everything. Specific products for specific surfaces, a rotation for deep cleaning, a method for organizing that had taken decades to perfect. The thought of someone else disrupting that system made her break out in a cold sweat. Before Dorothy could say another word, Marcus was already dragging his garbage bags toward the hallway. Which room should we take? The guest room, okay? The guest room. The room Dorothy had carefully prepared for the grandchildren she'd always hoped would come visit someday. The room with the twin beds covered in handmade quilts that her mother had stitched during the long winter evenings of Dorothy's childhood. Her dresser topped with framed photos of Marcus at various ages, gap-toothed at 6, serious in his graduation cap, handsome in his army uniform before he'd washed out of basic training. The bookshelf filled with children's classics she'd collected over the years, hoping someday to read them to small voices that would call her grandma. Her hope chest in physical form. Yes, I suppose that would work, Dorothy heard herself saying, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. You're the best, Ma. This is just what we needed. A fresh start. You know, everything's going to be different this time. Dorothy had heard that phrase before. Everything's going to be different this time. It was Marcus's favorite refrain, the promise he made before every new job, every new relationship, every new beginning that somehow always led back to the same ending. Amber had somehow located Dorothy's remote control and was flipping through channels at maximum volume. The sudden blast of noise in Dorothy's usually quiet home was jarring. game shows and commercials and laugh tracks all blending together in a cacophony that made her temples throb. "Oh, I love this show," Amber squealed, settling on what appeared to be a reality program about people screaming at each other in a tropical location. The volume was so loud that Dorothy's carefully arranged collectibles on the mantelpiece seemed to vibrate with each commercial break and canned laugh. Dorothy winced as the sound seemed to shake the very foundations of her peaceful home. The china figurines her mother had left her, delicate shepherdesses and dancing ladies that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 47 years of careful handling, now trembled with each explosion of recorded laughter. "Amber, honey," Dorothy said carefully, raising her voice to be heard over the television, "could you maybe turn that down just a little of Neighbors Who?" "Oh, sure, no problem." Amber hit the volume button once, reducing the noise from deafening to merely thunderous. "Better?" Dorothy nodded weakly, though the sound was still loud enough to rattle the windows. She escaped to her kitchen, the one room in the house that still felt entirely hers. This was her sanctuary, painted a warm yellow that caught the morning light, filled with gadgets and appliances she'd chosen carefully over the years, organized according to a system that made sense to her and her alone. She put the kettle on with shaking hands, going through the motions of making tea like a meditation. Earl Grey from the tin she'd bought at this specialty shop downtown. 2 minutes steeping time, no more, no less. 1 teaspoon of honey from the local farm stand where she'd shopped for 15 years. These small rituals had anchored her through Edmund's illness, through the loneliness of widowhood, through the challenges of aging in a world that seemed to move faster every year. Through the kitchen window, she could see her neighbor, Harold Hoffman, working in his garden across the street. Harold was a few years older than Dorothy, a retired electrician who'd moved to Maple Ridge after his wife passed 2 years ago. They'd developed a comfortable friendship over the past year, built on shared morning walks and borrowed garden tools, and the kind of conversation that didn't require explanations or pretense. Harold looked up from his roses and waved, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Dorothy waved back, trying to inject more cheer into the gesture than she felt. How could she explain that, in the span of 20 minutes, her peaceful Saturday had transformed into something she didn't recognize? How could she tell him that strangers were making themselves comfortable in her living room, disrupting the careful order she had spent decades creating? From the living room came the sound of Amber's laughter, high and sharp, followed by Marcus's deeper chuckle. The sound should have made Dorothy happy. Her son, laughing in her home, finally spending time with her after months of absence. But instead, it felt invasive, like strangers had moved in and were performing happiness in her sacred spaces. The kettle whistled, and Dorothy poured the boiling water over her teabag with practiced precision. As she waited for it to steep, she noticed something that made her heart sink. Crumbs on her spotless counter. Small, dark crumbs that definitely hadn't been there 20 minutes ago when she'd wiped down every surface as part of her morning routine.
She followed the trail with her eyes and discovered an open bag of chocolate chip cookies. Her cookies, the ones she'd baked yesterday for the church auxiliary meeting, sitting torn open near the toaster. The bag was nearly half empty, and crumbs were scattered across the counter like evidence of a crime. "Oh!" Amber appeared in the kitchen doorway like a magician's assistant materializing from thin air. "I hope you don't mind. I found these cookies in your pantry and they looked amazing. Marcus said you wouldn't care, and I was seriously about to pass out from hunger." Dorothy stared at the decimated bag, her carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. She'd spent 2 hours yesterday making those cookies from scratch, using her mother's recipe that called for real butter and pure vanilla extract and chocolate chips that cost twice as much as the store brand. She'd carefully measured each ingredient, timed each batch to achieve the perfect golden brown color, and arranged them in neat rows to cool.
She'd planned to take them to tomorrow's church auxiliary meeting, where the ladies would compliment her baking and ask for the recipes she'd never quite shared completely. Those cookies represented hours of work, decades of tradition, and now they were being consumed by a stranger who'd helped herself without asking. No, of course not, Dorothy managed, the words sticking in her throat like paste. Please, help yourself. You're so sweet. These are incredible. Like, seriously, you could totally sell these and make a fortune. Amber grabbed 3 more cookies and headed back to the living room, leaving a trail of crumbs in her wake like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Dorothy stood alone in her kitchen, holding her teacup like a talisman, watching the crumbs scatter across her swept floor. This was how it started, she realized with growing dread. Not with dramatic confrontations or obvious violations, but with small compromises, tiny concessions that seemed unreasonable to refuse. Death by 1,000 cuts, each one insignificant on its own, but collectively devastating. From the guest room came the sound of drawers opening and closing, followed by Marcus's voice. Ma, where do you keep the extra hangers, and do you have any more blankets? These ones are kind of thin. The blankets weren't thin. They were the quilts Dorothy's mother had made during the long winters of her childhood, each one stitched with love and care and meant to last for generations. The thought of them being deemed inadequate by someone who'd been in her house for less than an hour made her chest tight with indignation. A hall closet, Dorothy called back, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. Top shelf. She heard footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the closet door opening with its familiar squeak, items being moved around without care. Then Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding her best comforter, the down-filled one she'd bought with Edmund's life insurance money and saved for special occasions that never seemed to come. That's my good comforter, Dorothy said quietly, the words barely audible over the television noise from the living room. Marcus paused, looking at her with mild irritation. Oh, well, do you have another one? Amber gets cold really easily, and those quilts you have in there are pretty old and scratchy. Dorothy looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time in years. When had he stopped asking and started taking? When had her love become something he assumed rather than appreciated? When had she become nothing more than a resource to be utilized when convenient? Yes, she said finally, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. You can use it. Thanks, Ma. You're the best. Marcus's smile was quick and dismissive, the same expression he'd worn as a teenager when she'd agreed to extend his curfew or increase his allowance. It was the smile of someone who'd gotten what they wanted and was already thinking about the next thing they needed. As Marcus disappeared back down the hallway with her precious comforter, Dorothy realized she was still holding her teacup, and the tea inside had grown completely cold. She dumped it down the sink and rinsed the cup carefully, placing it in the dishwasher with the methodical precision that had governed her daily routines for decades. The simple act of washing the cup grounded her, reminded her of who she was and what mattered to her. Order, routine, respect for the things that had value. These weren't old-fashioned concepts. They were the foundation of a civilized life. Through the kitchen window, she watched Harold finish his gardening and head inside his own house. His windows began to glow with warm yellow light as evening approached, and she could imagine him settling into his favorite chair with a book and a cup of coffee, enjoying the peaceful solitude she'd taken for granted until 20 minutes ago. How simple his life looked from the outside. Peaceful, orderly, entirely his own. No unexpected visitors demanding accommodation, no one treating his home like a hotel or his belongings like community property. Just a man in his own space, living according to his own rhythms and rules. Dorothy glanced at the digital clock on the microwave. 4:23 p.m. Marcus and Amber had been in her house for less than an hour, and already everything felt different. Her living room echoed with unfamiliar voices and inappropriate laughter. Her guest room housed people she barely knew. Her carefully maintained peace had been replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that made her shoulders tense and her jaw ache.
But they were family, she reminded herself. The words like a prayer she wasn't sure she believed anymore. Marcus was her son, and family helped family. Even when help felt suspiciously like invasion. Even when temporary felt like a word that had lost all meaning. She walked to the window and watched the sun continue its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded her of the sunsets she and Edmund used to watch from the porch swing he'd built during their first year in the house. Those quiet evenings felt like they belonged to someone else's life now, a simpler time when home meant sanctuary, and privacy was a given rather than a luxury. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that she'd just made a mistake. A big one. But she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the duties of a good mother and a gracious hostess. After all, family was family, and blood was supposed to be thicker than water. Even when that blood felt like it was slowly draining the life out of everything you held dear. The laughter from the living room swelled again, too loud and too comfortable for people who'd been in her home for less than an hour. Temporary, she told herself again, like a mantra that might become true if she repeated it often enough. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that more than just the day was coming to an end. Something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world, and she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to shift it back. The word temporary echoed in her mind as she stood at her kitchen sink, watching her own reflection in the darkening window. Behind her, the sounds of her invaded home continued. Television too loud, voices too familiar with space they hadn't earned. The casual destruction of peace she'd spent 70 years learning to value. Temporary, the most dangerous lie she'd ever agreed to believe. Sunday morning arrived with the gentle chime of Dorothy's antique alarm clock, a sound that had woken her at exactly 6:30 a.m. for the past 15 years. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of her house, settling into the new day, before remembering that her home was no longer entirely her own. The realization hit her like cold water. Marcus and Amber were sleeping just down the hall in her carefully prepared guest room, surrounded by her mother's quilts and family photographs, breathing their unfamiliar presence into spaces that had been hers alone for 3 years. Dorothy slipped into her terry cloth robe, the soft blue one Edmund had given her for their last Christmas together, and padded quietly toward the kitchen. She'd always treasured these early morning hours when the house was silent and the day stretched ahead full of gentle possibilities, making coffee by the window while watching Harold tend his roses across the street, planning her day around small pleasures and necessary tasks, enjoying the profound peace that came with being completely alone in her own space. But as she reached the kitchen doorway, Dorothy stopped short. The sight before her made her stomach clench with dismay. Her spotless kitchen, the room she'd cleaned meticulously before bed, as she had every night for decades, looked like a small tornado had passed through it. The sink overflowed with dirty dishes, plates encrusted with what appeared to be dried pizza sauce, glasses sticky with soda residue, utensils scattered haphazardly across the counter. Her good serving bowl, the ceramic one with hand-painted roses that had belonged to her grandmother, sat half-filled with congealed cheese sauce that had hardened into an orange crust. Empty takeout containers littered the counter, Chinese food boxes, pizza cartons, and plastic containers that reeked of grease and MSG. Her trash can, which she'd emptied just yesterday, overflowed with beer bottles and fast food wrappers. Crumbs covered every surface, and there was a mysterious sticky stain on her pristine linoleum floor near the refrigerator. Dorothy stood frozen in the doorway, her hand clutching the frame for support. In 47 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood, her kitchen had never looked like this.
Even during Edmund's worst illness, when she'd been exhausted to do more than the bare minimum, she'd maintained basic cleanliness and order. "Morning, Ma." Marcus's voice boomed from behind her, startling her so badly she nearly stumbled. He appeared in the kitchen wearing only boxer shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair sticking up at odd angles and stubble covering his cheeks. Dorothy turned to face her son, trying to process the casual destruction around her. "Marcus, what happened here?" He glanced around the kitchen with mild confusion, as if seeing it for the first time. "What do you mean?" "The dishes, the mess, this..." Dorothy gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. "Oh, that." Marcus opened her refrigerator and began rummaging through its contents with the same casual ownership he'd shown as a teenager raiding her kitchen after school. "Yeah, we got hungry after you went to bed. Hope you don't mind. We ordered some food. There wasn't much in the fridge." There had been plenty in the refrigerator. She kept it well stocked with fresh vegetables, lean meats, dairy products, and leftovers from her careful meal planning. She'd spent Saturday morning grocery shopping at 3 different stores to get the best prices and freshest ingredients, a routine she'd maintained for decades. "You could have asked," Dorothy said quietly, watching Marcus pull out her leftover pot roast, the one she'd planned to have for Sunday dinner with mashed potatoes and green beans.
Didn't want to wake you. Marcus unwrapped the foil and began eating the cold meat with his fingers, standing at the counter like he was grabbing a quick snack instead of consuming someone else's carefully planned meal. "This is pretty good. A little dry, maybe, but not bad." Dorothy felt heat rise in her cheeks. That pot roast had taken her 3 hours to prepare, browning the meat, chopping vegetables, adjusting seasonings until it was perfect. She'd been looking forward to it all week, one of the small pleasures that made her solitary meals feel less lonely. "That was for today's dinner," she managed. Marcus paused mid-bite, looking genuinely surprised. "Oh, sorry, Ma. I didn't know you had plans for it." He continued eating, apparently unconcerned by her distress. "No big deal, though, right? We can order pizza or something." The casual dismissal of her time, her effort, her carefully laid plans made Dorothy's hands shake. She busied herself making coffee, going through the familiar motions while trying to steady her breathing. Measure the coffee, add the water, press the button. Simple tasks that usually brought her comfort, but now felt like moving through molasses. "Where's Amber?" Dorothy asked, mainly to fill the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. "Still sleeping. She's not really a morning person." Marcus finished the pot roast and moved on to exploring her cabinets, opening doors and examining contents with the thoroughness of a health inspector. "You got any cereal? Something with sugar. I can't do that healthy stuff." Dorothy did have cereal. Carefully chosen whole grain options that supported heart health and provided sustained energy. She'd given up sugary cereals decades ago, part of the gradual lifestyle changes that had helped her maintain her health as she aged. "There's granola in the pantry," she offered. Marcus made a face like she'd suggested eating cardboard. "Nah, that's okay. I'll grab something at the store later." He found her coffee mugs and poured himself a cup from the pot that had just finished brewing, adding so much sugar that Dorothy winced. "This is nice, Ma. Really peaceful here. I can see why you like it." The irony of his statement, praising the peace while simultaneously destroying it, was lost on him completely. Dorothy poured her own coffee and retreated to the kitchen table, the same spot where she'd sat yesterday afternoon planning her week, back when her biggest concern was whether to plant mums or pansies in her fall flower bed. "Marcus," she began carefully, "about the dishes." "Oh, don't worry about those. Amber said she'd clean up when she gets up. She's great at that stuff." Marcus leaned against her counter, completely comfortable in his partial undress, apparently unaware that his mother might not want to see him in his underwear at 70 years old. Dorothy glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m. Most people would be up by now, especially on a Sunday when church services started at 9. But she said nothing, instead focusing on her coffee and trying to ignore the chaos surrounding her usual morning routine. "What time is church?" Marcus asked suddenly. The question surprised her.
Marcus hadn't voluntarily attended church since his confirmation at 14, and he'd made his opinions about organized religion quite clear over the years. "Service starts at 9, Dorothy replied cautiously. "Cool. Mind if we tag along?" Amber's been wanting to check out different churches. She's really spiritual, into crystals and meditation and all that stuff. I tried to imagine Amber, with her ripped jeans and electric blue nail polish, sitting in the traditional sanctuary of First Presbyterian, where the average age was 65 and the dress code was unstated but strictly observed. The mental image made her coffee taste bitter. "Of course," she heard herself saying. "Everyone's welcome." "Awesome. We'll be ready by 8:30 or so." Marcus drained his coffee cup and set it in the sink, on top of the existing pile of dishes. "I'm gonna grab a shower. Hope you got plenty of hot water." As Marcus disappeared toward the bathroom, Dorothy sat alone in her destroyed kitchen, holding her coffee like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Through the window, she could see Harold already at work in his garden, methodically deadheading his roses and preparing his flower beds for autumn. His movements were deliberate and careful, the actions of someone who understood that maintenance was an ongoing act of love. She thought about her own garden, neglected yesterday for the first time in years because she'd been too distracted by her unexpected houseguests. The mums she'd planned to plant still sat in their plastic containers on the back porch, probably stressed from lack of water and attention. The sound of running water echoed through the house, Marcus using her shower, her hot water, her towels. Dorothy had always been conscious of water usage and energy costs, part of the gradual lifestyle changes that had helped her maintain her health as she aged. The idea of someone else using her resources without consideration for the cost made her chest tight with anxiety. At 7:45, Amber finally emerged from the guest room like a celebrity making a grand entrance. She wore a short black dress that barely covered her thighs, paired with the same stiletto heels that had damaged Dorothy's porch the day before. Her makeup was heavy and dramatic, false eyelashes, bright red lipstick, and enough foundation to paint a small wall. "Good morning," Amber sang, her voice carrying that same artificially bright quality that had grated on Dorothy's nerves yesterday. "I slept like a baby. Your guest room is so cozy, though I have to say, those quilts are super itchy. Do you have anything in cotton or maybe bamboo fiber?"
Dorothy's mother had spent months creating those quilts, carefully selecting fabrics and stitching intricate patterns by hand during the long winter evenings of the Great Depression. They were family heirlooms, meant to be treasured and preserved, not criticized by someone who'd been in the house for less than 24 hours. "They're antiques," Dorothy said carefully. "My mother made them." "Oh, that's so sweet," Amber's tone suggested she found the quilts charmingly primitive rather than valuable. "She must have had a lot of time on her hands. I bet you can get some really nice modern ones at Target for like $20. The casual dismissal of her family's history and craftsmanship made Dorothy's coffee turn to acid in her stomach. Those quilts represented countless hours of work, generations of women who'd taken pride in creating beautiful, functional art with their own hands. To suggest replacing them with mass-produced alternatives was like suggesting she replace her wedding ring with costume jewelry. "Would you like some coffee?" Dorothy asked, mainly to change the subject before she said something she might regret. "Oh, I don't drink coffee. Too acidic. Do you have any green tea? Or maybe some almond milk? I'm mostly dairy-free, except for cheese, because, hello, cheese is life." Amber laughed at her own joke while opening Dorothy's refrigerator and examining its contents with the same proprietary air Marcus had shown. Dorothy had regular milk, the 2% kind she'd used for decades, and a basic selection of Lipton tea bags. The idea of stocking specialty items for guests who'd invited themselves seemed presumptuous, but Amber's disappointment was obvious. "Regular tea is fine," Amber said with a martyred sigh. "I'll just have to detox extra hard this week." She spotted the dirty dishes in the sink and made a sound of surprise. "Oh, wow, Marcus really went to town last night, didn't he? Don't worry, I'll clean all this up after church. I'm super good at cleaning." The promise felt hollow, delivered with the same casual disregard for commitment that characterized everything else about Amber's presence. Dorothy had heard similar promises from Marcus for decades, assurances that were given easily and forgotten just as quickly.
Marcus reappeared wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a laundry basket. His hair was damp and slicked back, and he'd made an effort to shave, though he'd missed several spots. For Marcus, this represented dressing up. "Ready for church," he announced. "Where should we meet you? Want us to drive separate or ride together?" Dorothy hadn't considered the logistics. Her small Honda Civic barely accommodated her modest needs. Groceries, doctor's appointments, weekly errands. The idea of sharing that intimate space with two other people, especially when one of them was wearing enough perfume to fumigate a small building, made her claustrophobic. "We can ride together," she said, immediately regretting the decision. The drive to First Presbyterian normally took 8 minutes and provided Dorothy with a peaceful transition from her private morning routine to the gentle sociability of Sunday service. She'd drive slowly through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, listening to classical music on the radio and mentally preparing for the hymns and prayers that had anchored her Sundays for 50 years. But with Marcus in the passenger seat fiddling with her radio stations and Amber in the back providing running commentary on every house they passed, "Ooh, that one's cute. Ew, who chose that color? Do you think they're rich? They look rich." The drive felt more like being trapped in a mobile circus than a spiritual preparation. Dorothy parked in her usual spot in the church lot, a space she'd claimed informally for over a decade. As they walked toward the entrance, she caught sight of several familiar faces turning to stare at her unexpected companions. Ethel Morrison, who ran the women's auxiliary, raised her eyebrows at Amber's outfit. Frank Henderson, the head usher, looked confused by Marcus's presence after years of his absence. "This is so quaint," Amber whispered loudly as they entered the sanctuary. "It's like stepping back in time, very retro." Dorothy cringed at the volume of Amber's voice and the inappropriate commentary. First Presbyterian was a beautiful church, built in 1923 with careful attention to architectural detail and acoustic design. The stained glass windows were donated by founding families, the wooden pews were hand-carved by local craftsmen, and the pipe organ was considered one of the finest in the county. They found seats in Dorothy's usual pew, 4th row from the front on the right side. She had sat in that same spot every Sunday since Edmund's death, finding comfort in the routine and familiarity. But today, wedged between Marcus and Amber, she felt like an intruder in her own sacred space. Pastor Williams began the service with the traditional call to worship, his gentle voice carrying across the sanctuary with practiced warmth. Dorothy tried to focus on the familiar words, the hymns she'd sung thousands of times, the prayers that had comforted her through every major transition of her adult life. But Marcus kept checking his phone, the bright screen a distraction in the dim sanctuary. Amber whispered comments throughout the service. "His hair is so white," during the scripture reading. "I love her shoes," during the prayer requests. "How much longer?" during the sermon. Dorothy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as other congregants began to notice the disruption. These were people who'd known her for decades, who'd supported her through Edmund's illness and death, who respected her as a faithful member of their community. The idea that they might judge her based on her guests' behavior made her stomach churn with shame.
During the passing of the peace, a time when congregants traditionally greeted each other with handshakes and brief conversations, Amber became particularly animated. She introduced herself to everyone within reach, loudly proclaiming how blessed she felt to be there and how amazing the church was. Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, but inappropriate, like someone who'd mistaken a funeral for a party. Marcus, meanwhile, took the opportunity to scope out the congregation with the calculating eye of someone assessing potential opportunities. Dorothy recognized that look from his teenage years when he'd evaluated every social situation for what it might yield in terms of personal advantage. When the service finally ended, Dorothy wanted nothing more than to escape to her car and return to the sanctuary of her home. But Amber had apparently decided to network, engaging Pastor Williams in an enthusiastic conversation about the church's energy and spiritual vibrations. "Your grandson seems lovely," said Margaret Foster, one of Dorothy's closest friends in the congregation. She was clearly confused by Marcus's presence, since Dorothy had never mentioned him having children. "He's my son," Dorothy corrected quietly. Margaret's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Dorothy had talked about Marcus over the years, usually in the context of prayer requests or gentle concerns about his life choices. She knew he lived several states away and rarely visited, but she'd never met him in person. "Oh, how wonderful that he's visiting!" Margaret's smile was strained, clearly unsure how to process this development.
"They're staying with me temporarily," Dorothy explained, the word feeling more hollow each time she used it. "How nice for you to have family close by," Margaret replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced this was a positive development. The drive home was even more challenging than the drive to church. Amber provided a detailed critique of everyone she'd met, their clothes, their apparent financial status, and their spiritual energy levels. Marcus seemed pleased with the morning, apparently viewing the church as a successful reconnaissance mission rather than a worship experience. "Nice little setup you got there, Ma," Marcus said as they pulled into Dorothy's driveway. "Seems like a tight-knit community. A lot of older folks with money, I'm guessing." The mercenary tone of his observation made Dorothy's heart sink. She'd hoped that bringing Marcus to church might rekindle some connection to the values she'd tried to instill in him as a child. Instead, he seemed to view her faith community as a potential resource to be exploited. Back home, Dorothy changed into comfortable clothes and tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy. She'd planned to spend Sunday afternoon reading and tending to her garden, simple pleasures that restored her spirit after the gentle stimulation of church and fellowship. But Amber and Marcus had apparently decided to treat her home like a vacation resort. Marcus claimed the living room television, channel surfing with the volume loud enough to be heard throughout the house. Amber spread her belongings across the guest room and bathroom, transforming the carefully organized spaces into what looked like a small explosion at a cosmetics factory. By 2 o'clock, Dorothy's kitchen still looked like a disaster zone. Amber's promise to clean up had apparently been forgotten in favor of a complicated skincare routine that involved multiple products and enough steam to fog up the bathroom mirror. Marcus had added to the mess by making himself a sandwich, leaving dirty dishes and food debris in his wake. Dorothy stood in her kitchen doorway, surveying the damage and feeling increasingly displaced in her own home. The chaos wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, a fundamental disruption of the peace she'd cultivated so carefully since Edmund's death. Outside, Harold was working in his garden again, methodically preparing his beds for winter. His movements were purposeful and calm, the actions of someone who understood that home was a sanctuary to be protected and preserved. Dorothy found herself wondering what her house looked like from his perspective, whether the chaos inside was somehow visible from the outside, whether her carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack. At 3 o'clock, when the dishes still sat unwashed and Amber showed no signs of fulfilling her promise, Dorothy quietly began cleaning up herself. She moved slowly and deliberately, salvaging what could be saved and disposing of what was beyond redemption. Her grandmother's serving bowl required 20 minutes of soaking to remove the hardened cheese sauce. Her good dish towels were stained with grease that might never come out. As she worked, Dorothy felt something fundamental shifting inside her. The woman who had welcomed her son and his girlfriend 24 hours ago with love and optimism was being replaced by someone harder, more cautious, more aware of the difference between hospitality and exploitation. Marcus appeared in the kitchen while she was scrubbing the last of the pots, looking surprised to find her working. "You didn't have to do that, Ma," he said, though he made no move to help. Amber would have gotten to it eventually. "It's fine," Dorothy replied, though it wasn't fine at all. Nothing about the situation was fine.
"We were thinking of grabbing dinner somewhere," Marcus continued. "You want to come with us? Our treat." The offer should have pleased her. The chance to spend time with her son, to be taken out for a meal she didn't have to prepare herself. But Dorothy found herself declining, claiming fatigue when what she really needed was solitude. After Marcus and Amber left in his rumbling pickup truck, Dorothy walked through her house surveying the damage. The living room showed signs of their occupancy. Cushions displaced, surfaces sticky with unknown substances, her carefully arranged magazines scattered and wrinkled. The bathroom smelled like a perfume factory and was littered with cosmetics and hair products she didn't recognize. The guest room looked like a small hurricane had passed through it. Clothes were draped over every surface, shoes scattered across the floor, and personal items spread across the dresser that had once displayed her carefully arranged family photographs. Her mother's quilts were bunched and twisted, treated like disposable bedding rather than family heirlooms. Dorothy sat on her own bed, in her own room, and tried to process what was happening to her carefully ordered life. In 24 hours, strangers had moved into her space, consumed her food,
disrupted her routines, and made themselves comfortable in ways that felt invasive and presumptuous. The word temporary echoed in her mind, but it was beginning to feel like a promise that had never been meant to be kept. She thought about Marcus's casual appropriation of her belongings, Amber's dismissive attitude toward her family treasures, their assumption that her home was their home simply because she'd been too kind to say no. Outside her bedroom window, the sun was beginning its descent toward evening, painting her garden in shades of gold and amber. She should be out there planting her mums, deadheading her roses, preparing her flower beds for the changing season. Instead, she was hiding in her own bedroom, feeling like a refugee in her own home. Dorothy picked up the telephone and dialed her friend Margaret's number, then hung up before it could ring. What would she say? That her son and his girlfriend had been in her house for one day, and she was already regretting her decision to help from? That she felt invaded and overwhelmed and completely out of control? She couldn't say those things, not to Margaret or anyone else. They made her sound petty and ungrateful for the opportunity to help her own child. They made her sound like the unreasonable old woman Amber had probably already decided she was. But as Dorothy lay on her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her occupied house, television too loud, footsteps too heavy, voices too comfortable, she couldn't shake the feeling that something precious was being destroyed. Not just her peace and privacy, but something more fundamental. Her sense of home as sanctuary, her belief that love and kindness would be met with respect and gratitude. The evening stretched ahead like a test she wasn't sure she was prepared to take. Marcus and Amber would return from dinner full of energy and expectations, ready to claim more of her space and attention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new intrusions, new evidence that temporary was becoming permanent whether she agreed to it or not. Dorothy closed her eyes and tried to remember what her house had felt like just 24 hours ago. Quiet, peaceful, entirely hers. But already that memory was beginning to fade, replaced by the reality of a home that no longer felt like home at all. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Dorothy realized that she was no longer waiting for her guests to leave. She was waiting for the courage to ask them to go. The question was, how long would that take? And how much of herself would she lose in the process? Monday morning arrived with the jarring sound of Dorothy's alarm clock at 6:30 a.m., but instead of the peaceful silence she'd grown accustomed to, her house buzzed with activity that felt foreign and intrusive. The shower had been running since 6:15, Marcus preparing for his job interview, and the sound of blow-drying hair echoed from the guest bathroom where Amber was apparently getting ready for whatever her day might hold. Dorothy lay in bed for an extra few minutes, steeling herself for whatever chaos awaited her in the kitchen. After yesterday's disaster, she'd made a mental list of ground rules that needed to be established, simple, reasonable boundaries that any houseguest should understand and respect. She had practiced the conversation in her mind as she had fallen asleep, choosing words that were firm but not confrontational, clear but not accusatory. But as she entered the kitchen, her carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. If anything, the mess was worse than yesterday. Coffee grounds were scattered across her counter like dark snow, apparently the result of someone attempting to make coffee without understanding how her machine worked. A half-empty carton of orange juice sat open on the counter, already developing a skin of bacteria that made Dorothy's stomach turn. Crumbs from what appeared to be toasted bagels, her bagels, the everything ones that she had bought for herself as a small weekend treat, covered every surface within a 3-foot radius of the toaster. More disturbing was the discovery that someone had attempted to cook eggs and abandoned the project halfway through. Her non-stick pan, the expensive one that she had saved for months to buy, sat on the stove with what looked like concrete scrambled eggs welded to it. The smell of burnt protein hung in the air like an accusation.
Morning, Ma.
Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking surprisingly professional in his khakis and collared shirt. For a moment, Dorothy felt a flutter of maternal pride. Her son, dressed for success, apparently taking steps to improve his situation. "Good morning," Dorothy replied carefully, gesturing toward the destroyed kitchen. "Marcus, we need to talk about—" "Can't right now," Marcus interrupted, grabbing a piece of toast that Amber had apparently made and abandoned. "Running late for the interview. Big opportunity, you know? This could really change everything for us." The phrase, "for us," hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy had hoped that Marcus getting a job would mean independence, a step toward him and Amber finding their own place. But his phrasing suggested a more permanent arrangement, as if her home had become their home by default. "But after you get back," Dorothy tried again. "Absolutely. We'll sit down and talk about everything. Maybe we can even celebrate if I get the job." Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, leaving Dorothy standing in her destroyed kitchen with words unspoken and boundaries unset. Amber emerged from the guest room 20 minutes later, wearing what appeared to be pajamas, tiny shorts, and a tank top that left little to the imagination. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup flawlessly applied, as if she'd spent considerable time preparing for a day of doing absolutely nothing. "Good morning, Dorothy." Amber's voice carried that same artificial brightness that had grated on Dorothy's nerves since Saturday. "Isn't this exciting? Marcus is so nervous about his interview. I told him he'll do great. He's super charming when he wants to be." Dorothy looked at the young woman who'd invaded her kitchen wearing practically nothing and felt something cold settle in her chest. "Amber, I'd like to discuss some house rules." "House rules?" Amber's laugh was like tinkling bells, but there was something sharp underneath it. "You're so cute! Like we're back in college or something." The dismissive tone made Dorothy's backbone stiffen. She'd taught third grade for 30 years and knew the difference between innocent enthusiasm and calculated disrespect. This was the latter. "I'm serious," Dorothy said, her voice taking on the firm quality she'd used with disruptive students. "This is my home, and I expect certain standards to be maintained." Amber's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Of course! I totally get it. You want us to be respectful. We absolutely will be. Marcus and I are super clean people. We just had a crazy busy morning, you know?" It was a non-apology wrapped in false agreement, the kind of response Dorothy had heard from countless children who'd been caught misbehaving. But Amber wasn't a child. She was an adult woman standing in Dorothy's kitchen in her underwear, making excuses for behavior that required no explanation if it simply didn't happen. "Let me be specific," Dorothy continued, pulling strength from decades of classroom management experience. "The kitchen needs to be cleaned after each use. Dishes should be washed immediately, not left in the sink. Food should be put away properly, and any messes should be cleaned up completely." "Of course!" Amber nodded enthusiastically, but her eyes had gone flat. "That makes total sense. I'll make sure Marcus knows too." "No smoking anywhere on the property, inside or outside. The smell carries and I have neighbors to consider." "Oh, neither of us smoke." "Well, Marcus might have the occasional cigarette when he's stressed, but it's not like a regular thing." The qualifier made Dorothy's heart sink. In her experience, people who didn't smoke but made exceptions for stress were people who smoked regularly but didn't want to admit it. Quiet hours after 10 p.m. No loud music, television, or conversation. I go to bed early and I need to be able to sleep. "Of course! We're super respectful of that stuff. We'll probably be in bed by then. And I'd appreciate it if you could dress appropriately when you're in the common areas of the house," Dorothy added, pointedly looking at Amber's revealing outfit. For the first time, Amber's mask slipped completely. Her eyes narrowed and her voice took on an edge that made Dorothy step back involuntarily. "Are you saying there's something wrong with how I'm dressed?" "I'm saying this is a conservative household, and I'd appreciate some consideration for that fact." "Conservative." Amber repeated the word like it tasted bad. "Right. Well, I suppose I can try to meet your standards." The way she said standards made it sound like Dorothy was being unreasonably demanding rather than setting basic boundaries in her own home. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Dorothy felt a wave of relief, thinking Marcus had returned from his interview early.
Instead, a complete stranger walked into her kitchen, a tall, thin man with long, greasy hair and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. "Hey, babe," the stranger said to Amber, completely ignoring Dorothy's presence. "Marcus said you were staying here. Nice place." Dorothy's mouth fell open. This man had just walked into her house without knocking, without invitation, without even acknowledging that she existed. He moved through her kitchen like he belonged there, opening her refrigerator and helping himself to her food. "Dorothy, this is Jake," Amber said casually, as if random men appearing in Dorothy's kitchen was perfectly normal. "He's a friend of ours. Jake, this is Marcus's mom." Jake finally looked at Dorothy, giving her a brief nod that felt more dismissive than polite. "Cool. Mind if I grab a drink? I'm dying of thirst." The presumption was breathtaking. This stranger was asking permission to take her belongings while already in the process of taking them. He had extracted a can of soda from her refrigerator and popped it open before Dorothy could even process what was happening. Who told you that you could come in here?" Dorothy managed. Jake looked confused, as if the question made no sense. "Marcus said to come by. Something about maybe helping him move some stuff later?" "Move stuff?" Dorothy's voice rose an octave. "What stuff?" Amber jumped in quickly, her voice bright and reassuring. "Oh, just some things Marcus has in storage, nothing major. Jake has a truck, so he offered to help bring over a few boxes." The idea of more of Marcus's belongings being moved into her house made Dorothy's chest tighten with panic. She'd agreed to temporary accommodation for 2 people, not a gradual relocation of an entire household. "I didn't agree to that," Dorothy said firmly. "It's just a few boxes," Amber repeated, but her tone had lost its artificial sweetness. "Personal stuff, clothes and things. Marcus didn't think you'd mind since we're staying here anyway." There it was, the assumption that Dorothy's agreement to temporary housing included unlimited expansion of that arrangement. First, Amber appeared without warning, then belongings multiplied overnight, and now strangers were walking into her house to facilitate the transfer of even more possessions. "I do mind," Dorothy said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "This is my home, and I decide what comes into it." Jake and Amber exchanged a look that Dorothy couldn't quite interpret, but it made her skin crawl. There was something calculating about it, as if they were silently communicating about how to handle this unexpected resistance. "Look, lady," Jake said, his casual tone not quite masking the disrespect underneath. "Marcus is my buddy, and he asked for help. I'm not trying to cause problems, I'm just doing a favor for a friend." "Then you can do that favor somewhere else," Dorothy replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't know you, I didn't invite you, and I want you to leave." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Jake looked to Amber for guidance, while Amber's face cycled through several emotions before settling on wounded innocence. "Dorothy, there's no need to be hostile," Amber said, her voice taking on a hurt quality that felt completely manufactured. "Jake's a really good guy. He's just trying to help us out." "I'm not being hostile," Dorothy replied. "I'm being clear. This is my house, and I have the right to control who enters it." Jake set down his soda can with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a small explosion. "Fine, whatever. I'll wait outside." He looked at Amber. "Text me when the drama's over." As Jake stalked out of the kitchen, Dorothy felt a mixture of victory and unease. She had successfully removed an unwanted intruder from her home, but the experience had revealed something troubling about how Marcus and Amber viewed her boundaries. They saw them as suggestions rather than rules, inconveniences to be worked around rather than limits to be respected. "That was really unnecessary," Amber said once Jake's footsteps had faded. "He's harmless. You didn't need to treat him like a criminal." "I treated him like someone who entered my house without permission, because that's exactly what he is." Amber's expression hardened further. "You know, Dorothy, Marcus warned me that you could be difficult, but I told him you seemed really sweet. I guess he knows you better than I do." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Dorothy like a physical blow. The idea that Marcus had discussed her with this stranger, characterizing her as difficult for having standards and boundaries in her own home, felt like a betrayal of everything she had tried to be as a mother. "What exactly did Marcus tell you about me?" Dorothy asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Amber shrugged, apparently realizing she'd said too much. "Nothing specific, just that you can be kind of set in your ways. Old-fashioned, but he said if we were patient with you, you'd come around." Come around. As if Dorothy's desire for respect and order in her own home was a character flaw to be overcome rather than a reasonable expectation to be honored. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dorothy said slowly. "This arrangement is temporary. You and Marcus are welcome to stay while he looks for work and finds an apartment, but this is still my home. My rules apply here." "Of course," Amber agreed, but her smile was sharp around the edges. "Your house, your rules. I get it completely." The agreement felt hollow, delivered with the same lack of sincerity that had characterized all of Amber's promises so far. Dorothy had the sinking feeling that she'd won this particular battle while losing something much more important, the illusion that Marcus and Amber viewed her as anything more than an obstacle to overcome. After Amber retreated to the guest room, Dorothy spent the next hour cleaning her kitchen yet again. But this time the work felt different. Instead of the meditative quality that household tasks usually held for her, she found herself scrubbing with barely contained anger, attacking stains and residue as if they were personal affronts.
The nonstick pan was ruined. The burned eggs had bonded with the coating in a way that no amount of soaking could fix. Dorothy stared at the destroyed cookware and felt something break inside her chest. It wasn't about the money, though replacing the pan would strain her careful budget. It was about the casual disregard for her belongings, the assumption that her things were disposable and replaceable. At 11 o'clock, Dorothy's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Harold Hoffman standing on her porch, holding a small pot of chrysanthemums and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "Mornin', Dorothy," Harold said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Brought you these for your front beds. Thought you might like the color." The mums were beautiful, deep burgundy with hints of gold, exactly the type Dorothy would have chosen for herself. The thoughtfulness of the gift, coming on the heels of the morning's confrontations, made her eyes well up with unexpected tears. "Harold, they're lovely," she managed. "Thank you so much." "Everything all right?" Harold asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Noticed you've had some activity around here lately." Dorothy glanced back at her house, where Amber's inappropriate laughter was drifting from the guest room, and Jake's truck still sat in her driveway like a claim flag. The contrast between Harold's respectful presence and the chaos that had invaded her home was stark. "My son is visiting," Dorothy said carefully, "with his girlfriend. It's an adjustment." Harold nodded slowly, understanding more than Dorothy had said. Family can be complicated. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who test our patience the hardest. The simple wisdom of his words made Dorothy's throat tighten. "I'm trying to be welcoming," she said, "but I feel like I'm losing control of my own home." "Hospitality is a virtue," Harold replied, "but so is self-respect. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marcus's truck pulling into the driveway. Harold glanced at the vehicle, then back at Dorothy, with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what she was dealing with. "I should let you get back to your family," Harold said diplomatically, "but if you need anything at all, you just holler. I'm right across the street." As Harold walked away, Dorothy felt a profound sense of loss. Here was a man who understood boundaries, who respected her space and autonomy, who treated her home and her person with the consideration she'd once taken for granted. The contrast with her current house guests couldn't have been starker. Marcus bounded up the porch steps with more energy than Dorothy had seen from him in years. "Great news, Ma! I got the job!" For a moment, Dorothy felt genuine happiness for her son. Despite all their problems, she wanted Marcus to succeed, wanted him to find stability and purpose in his life. "That's wonderful," she said, meaning it. "When do you start?" "Next Monday. Gives me a whole week to get settled and organized." Marcus's grin was infectious, and Dorothy found herself smiling despite her morning's frustrations. "So you'll be looking for an apartment this week?" Dorothy asked, hope creeping into her voice. Marcus's expression flickered slightly. "Well, that's the thing. The job comes with a 90-day probationary period. No benefits, lower pay until I prove myself. It might be smart to wait until I'm permanent before taking on a lease and all those deposits." Dorothy's heart sank. 90 days. 3 months of this chaos. 3 months of feeling like a stranger in her own home. Besides, Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to her distress, "this setup is working out great, isn't it? You get company, we get a place to stay while I establish myself in the new job. Win-win." The casual assumption that this arrangement benefited Dorothy in any way was so disconnected from reality that she actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor whatsoever. "Marcus, we need to discuss some ground rules," she began, but he was already heading for the door. "Absolutely, Ma, but first I need to call Jake back in. We've got those boxes to move, and I want to get everything settled before I start work next week." "I told his friend to leave," Dorothy said quickly. "I don't want strangers in my house without my permission." Marcus stopped and turned to face her, his expression shifting from celebratory to annoyed. "Jake's not a stranger, he's my friend. And those boxes have my clothes and important papers. I kinda need them. You should have asked first. I'm asking now." Marcus's tone had lost its warmth, taking on the edge Dorothy remembered from his teenage years when he didn't get his way. "The answer is no," Dorothy said, surprised by her own firmness. "Not today. You can make arrangements to get your things another time, after we've discussed the rules for living here." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing words he wanted to spit out. "Fine," he said finally, "but we're gonna need to talk about your attitude, Ma. Amber's pretty upset about how you treated Jake this morning." The idea that Dorothy needed to adjust her attitude in her own home, that she should apologize for protecting her boundaries, was so outrageous that she felt dizzy with anger. "My attitude?" she repeated. "You were pretty rude to him. He was just trying to help, and you acted like he was some kind of criminal." Marcus's voice carried the same wounded tone Amber had used, as if Dorothy's insistence on basic respect was an unreasonable attack on their character. "He walked into my house without permission and helped himself to my food," Dorothy said. "In what world is that acceptable behavior?" "He's my friend, Ma. That makes him welcome here."
"No," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It doesn't. This is my house. I decide who's welcome and who isn't. Your friendship doesn't override my authority in my own home." The silence that followed was charged with tension Dorothy had never felt with her son before. She could see him recalculating, reassessing his approach to a woman who was supposed to be easy to manage, but was proving unexpectedly resistant. "Okay," Marcus said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I can see you're stressed about all this change. Maybe we need to give you some time to adjust. But Ma, we're family. We need to find a way to make this work for everyone." The condescending tone, as if Dorothy's objections were symptoms of stress rather than legitimate concerns, made her want to scream. But she held her tongue, recognizing that Marcus was employing the same manipulation tactics he'd used as a teenager,
dismiss her concerns, then appeal to family loyalty to override her judgment. "We'll talk tonight," Dorothy said, "after dinner. All three of us. We need to establish clear expectations." "Sure thing," Marcus agreed, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure we can work everything out." As Marcus disappeared into the house, Dorothy stood on her porch holding Harold's chrysanthemums and feeling like a stranger in her own life. The flowers were beautiful, their rich colors a reminder of the peace and order she'd cultivated in her home before this invasion began. But even as she admired Harold's thoughtful gift, she could hear voices inside her house. Marcus on the phone with Jake, Amber complaining loudly about Dorothy's attitude, the casual destruction of the sanctuary she'd spent decades creating. Tonight, she told herself, tonight she would lay down the law, establish boundaries that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. She would reclaim her home and her authority, or she would ask them to leave. The question was whether she would have the courage to follow through when the moment came, or whether family loyalty would once again override her own needs and self-respect. As she walked inside to find a proper pot for Harold's mums, Dorothy felt the weight of the coming confrontation settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. But for the first time since Saturday afternoon, she also felt something else: determination. The testing phase was about to end. The real battle was about to begin. Tuesday evening arrived with the acrid smell of cigarette smoke drifting through Dorothy's carefully ventilated home like an unwelcome ghost. She'd been in her bedroom, trying to read the latest novel from the library's book club selection, when the unmistakable odor crept under her door and invaded her sanctuary. For a moment, she thought perhaps a neighbor was smoking outside. The smell carried on an errant breeze through an open window. But as Dorothy made her way toward the living room, the smell grew stronger, more concentrated, clearly emanating from inside her house. She found Marcus on her back porch, cigarette dangling from his lips, ash falling carelessly onto the wooden boards Edmund had stained and sealed with such pride just 5 years before his death. "Marcus," Dorothy said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "what are you doing?" He looked up with the casual expression of someone who'd been caught doing something mildly inappropriate rather than violating a clearly stated boundary. "Just having a quick smoke, Ma. Stressful day at the new job, you know?" Dorothy stared at her son, remembering with perfect clarity the conversation they'd had just yesterday morning. No smoking anywhere on the property, inside or out. The smell carries, and I have neighbors to consider. His response was immediate, complete understanding, absolute assurance that it wouldn't be a problem. "You agreed not to smoke on my property," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Marcus took another drag, apparently unconcerned by her distress. "Come on, Ma, it's outside. I'm not hurting anything." The casual dismissal of her clearly stated rule made Dorothy's hands shake with rage. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a memory lapse. This was deliberate defiance, a test to see how much disrespect she would tolerate in the name of family harmony. "Put it out now," Dorothy said firmly. "Now, or find somewhere else to smoke it." For a moment, father and son stared at each other across a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing second. Dorothy could see Marcus calculating, weighing his options, deciding how far he could push before facing real consequences. Finally, with theatrical reluctance, he dropped the cigarette and ground it under his heel, leaving the butt on her porch boards like a small declaration of war. "There. Happy now?" His tone carried the petulance of a teenager being forced to follow rules he considered unreasonable. Dorothy bent down and picked up the cigarette butt, along with 3 others she now noticed scattered around the porch furniture. "How long has this been going on?" She shrugged. "I don't know. A couple of days? Look, Ma, you're making a big deal out of nothing. It's not like I'm smoking in the house." The casual admission that he'd been violating her rules for days while looking her in the eye and lying about it made Dorothy feel physically sick. This wasn't a confused mistake of someone adjusting to new living arrangements. This was calculated deception from someone who viewed her boundaries as suggestions to be ignored when convenient. "We had an agreement. We had a conversation about preferences. I didn't realize you were issuing royal decrees." Marcus's voice carried a sarcastic edge that Dorothy had never heard directed at her before.
The transformation was startling. Gone was the grateful son asking for temporary help, replaced by someone who seemed to view her as an obstacle to his comfort rather than the mother who'd opened her home to him in his time of need. "This is my house," Dorothy said, her voice taking on the steel she'd perfected during 30 years of classroom management. "My rules aren't suggestions." "Right," Marcus said, his tone making it clear that he disagreed completely. "Your house, your rules. Got it." But even as he said the words, Dorothy could see in his expression that he'd gotten something entirely different. He'd learned exactly how far he could push before she'd push back, and he was already calculating his next move. Wednesday brought new violations, each one carefully calibrated to test Dorothy's resolve without quite crossing the line into open rebellion. She woke to find her morning newspaper missing from the front porch, eventually discovering it in the guest room trash can, apparently used as a makeshift ashtray for late-night smoking sessions. Her good scissors had disappeared from the kitchen drawer, later found in Amber's possession, used to trim split ends and abandoned on the bathroom counter with hair clippings still clinging to the blades. More disturbing was the discovery that someone had been going through her mail. Dorothy kept her correspondence in a neat stack on the kitchen counter, organized by priority and carefully maintained according to a system she'd developed over decades of careful bill management. But when she went to pay her monthly utilities, she found bills missing, letters opened and carelessly refolded, and personal correspondence shuffled out of order. "Have you seen my electric bill?" Dorothy asked Amber, who was sprawled across the living room sofa in what appeared to be her pajamas, though it was nearly noon. "Your what?" Amber didn't look up from her phone, where she was scrolling through social media with the dedication of someone conducting important research. "My electric bill. It should have arrived Monday, but I can't find it anywhere." "Oh, that," Amber waved dismissively toward the kitchen. "Marcus was looking at it. Something about figuring out the utility costs. He's super responsible about money stuff." The casual admission that Marcus had taken and examined her private financial information without permission made Dorothy's chest tighten with anxiety. Her bills contained sensitive information, account numbers, payment histories, personal details that could be used for identity theft or financial manipulation. "Where is it now?" Dorothy asked, trying to keep her voice level. "I don't know. Probably in his stuff somewhere. He'll give it back when he's done with it." Amber's tone suggested that Dorothy was being unreasonably impatient about getting her own mail back in her own house. Dorothy found the bill an hour later, buried under a pile of Marcus's belongings in the guest room, but finding it only made things worse. It had been opened and studied, with notes written in the margins in Marcus's handwriting, numbers circled, calculations scrawled across the back, as if he'd been analyzing her financial situation for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Marcus," Dorothy said when he returned from work that evening, "we need to talk about boundaries." He looked tired and irritated, like someone being asked to discuss something tedious after a long day. "What now, Ma?" "I went through your mail without permission. That's not acceptable." Marcus blinked, apparently surprised that she'd discovered his snooping. "I was just trying to understand the household expenses. If we're going to be contributing to utilities and stuff, I need to know what we're dealing with." The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, but Dorothy noticed that no contribution had been offered, no specific arrangements proposed. It felt more like reconnaissance than responsibility. "You don't go through my personal mail without asking," Dorothy said firmly. "Ever." Okay, no need to get all worked up about it. I was trying to be helpful." Marcus's tone carried the wounded innocence of someone being criticized for good intentions, but his eyes held something harder. "And I want those bills back. All of them." Marcus's expression flickered with something Dorothy couldn't quite identify. "Sure, no problem. They're just papers, Ma. I don't know why you're so paranoid about everything." The word paranoid hung in the air like poison gas. Dorothy wasn't paranoid. She was protective of her privacy and security, as any reasonable person should be. The suggestion that her concerns were symptoms of mental instability rather than legitimate boundaries felt like gaslighting of the most insidious kind. Thursday brought the discovery that would change everything. Dorothy was looking for her spare reading glasses, the one she kept in the kitchen drawer for reviewing recipes and bills.
when she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath a stack of dish towels was a folder containing photocopies of her personal documents: her driver's license, her social security card, her bank statements, her insurance policies. Documents that Marcus could only have accessed by going through her private papers while she slept or was out of the house. The violation felt so profound, so criminal, that Dorothy had to sit down to process what she was seeing. Each document had been carefully copied with certain information highlighted in yellow marker: account numbers, social security numbers, the contact information for her bank and insurance company. It looked like the preparation for identity theft, or worse, the groundwork for someone to assume control of her financial affairs.
Dorothy's hands shook as she examined the evidence of betrayal, so complete it took her breath away. This wasn't the impulsive snooping of someone curious about household expenses. This was systematic, premeditated violation by someone who viewed her not as a mother to be respected, but as a mark to be exploited. Looking for something? Amber's voice from the kitchen doorway made Dorothy jump like a guilty child, though she was the wronged party in her own home. "These," Dorothy said, holding up the folder with copies of her most sensitive documents. "What are these doing in my kitchen drawer?" Amber's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on defiant innocence. "Oh, those! Marcus needed copies for some paperwork, insurance stuff for his new job. You know how employers are these days. They want documentation of everything." The lie was so smoothly delivered that Dorothy almost believed it for a moment, but she'd worked in education long enough to recognize a practiced deceiver, and Amber's explanation crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. "His employer needs copies of my social security card?" Dorothy asked quietly. Amber's confident facade wavered slightly. "I don't know the specifics. You'd have to ask Marcus about that. I just know he was stressed about getting all the right paperwork together." "These are my personal documents. No one has the right to copy them without my permission." "Look, Dorothy," Amber said, dropping the pretense of sweetness entirely. "Marcus is trying to be responsible here. He's thinking about the future, about what happens if something happens to you. Someone needs to know where your important papers are." The casual assumption that Marcus should have access to her private affairs, combined with the implication that Dorothy was too old or incompetent to manage her own documents, made Dorothy's vision blur with rage. "Nothing is going to happen to me," Dorothy said, her voice deadly quiet. "And if it did, I have arrangements in place that don't involve my son stealing my personal information." "Stealing?" She laughed, but the sound held no humor. "That's a pretty harsh way to describe a son looking out for his mother's interests." Dorothy looked at this young woman who'd invaded her home and was now standing in her kitchen defending the indefensible, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. The last vestige of doubt about Marcus's intentions evaporated, replaced by cold, clear certainty about what she was dealing with. "Get out," Dorothy said simply. Amber's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Excuse me? Get out of my house. Now, both of you." "You can't be serious." Amber's voice took on a wheedling quality. "Dorothy, you're upset about a misunderstanding. Let's just calm down and talk about this rationally." "There's nothing to discuss. You and Marcus have violated my privacy, stolen my personal information, and lied to my face about it. I want you out." Amber's mask slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "You know what your problem is, Dorothy? You're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see other people happy. Marcus warned me you might try to sabotage this arrangement." The cruelty was breathtaking, but Dorothy felt oddly calm in the face of it. She'd seen Amber's true nature now, and it held no power to hurt her anymore. "This arrangement is over," Dorothy said. "You have until tomorrow evening to find somewhere else to go."
"We'll see about that," Amber replied, her voice dropping to something that sounded distinctly like a threat. "Marcus isn't going to let you throw us out over some stupid paperwork. He has rights here. The only right Marcus has here is what I choose to give him, and I'm choosing to give him nothing more." Amber stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps heavy with theatrical outrage. Dorothy could hear her on the phone within minutes, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone, probably Marcus, preparing him for the confrontation that was coming. Dorothy spent the rest of the afternoon calling her bank, her insurance company, and her credit monitoring service, alerting them to potential identity theft and requesting new account numbers and policies. The customer service representatives were sympathetic and efficient, but the process was exhausting and humiliating. How had she allowed this to happen? How had she let her love for her son blind her to such obvious manipulation and criminal behavior? When Marcus arrived home from work, he came prepared for battle. But instead of the angry confrontation Dorothy expected, he deployed a strategy that was far more sophisticated and devastating. "Ma, I told you about the misunderstanding this afternoon. I'm really sorry you're upset." The word misunderstanding was carefully chosen, designed to minimize and reframe his criminal violation of her privacy as a simple communication error. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Marcus. You copied my personal documents without permission. That's identity theft." Marcus's expression shifted to wounded innocence. "Identity theft? Ma, you're my mother. I would never steal from you. I was trying to help you get organized." The gaslighting was masterful, taking her legitimate concerns and reframing them as symptoms of confusion or a paranoia. Dorothy recognized the technique from her teaching days when manipulative students would try to convince her that she'd misunderstood situations she'd witnessed with her own eyes.
I don't need help getting organized. I need my son to respect my privacy and boundaries. Of course, Marcus agreed readily, and I do respect them. But, Ma, I have to ask, have you been feeling okay lately? You seem really stressed and suspicious about everything. Maybe you should talk to someone. The suggestion that her reasonable concerns were symptoms of mental decline was so calculatedly cruel that Dorothy actually gasped. This was the setup Amber had hinted at, the groundwork for claiming that Dorothy was incompetent and needed their help managing her affairs. "My mind is perfectly clear," Dorothy said. "Clear enough to know when I'm being manipulated." Marcus's expression shifted to concern so genuine-looking that Dorothy almost doubted her own perceptions. "Ma, the last thing I want is for you to feel manipulated. We're family. Everything I'm doing is because I love you and want to make sure you're taken care of." "Then you'll respect my decision when I tell you to leave." "Leave?" Marcus looked genuinely shocked. "Ma, you can't be serious. This is just a disagreement about paperwork. We can work this out." "It's not about paperwork. It's about trust. And you've broken mine completely." What followed was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Marcus cycled through every technique in the manipulator's handbook: denial, minimization, victim blaming, emotional appeals, and finally, devastating personal attacks disguised as concern. He reminded Dorothy of her age, her isolation, her need for family support as she got older. He painted himself as the devoted son who'd sacrificed to come help her, only to be rejected because of her paranoia and ingratitude. He suggested that her reaction was evidence of the mental decline he'd been worried about, the reason he'd felt compelled to organize her important documents in the first place. "I know you're scared, Ma," Marcus said, his voice soft with false compassion. "Getting older is frightening, but pushing away the people who love you isn't the answer. You need us more than you want to admit." The psychological assault was so sophisticated, so perfectly calibrated to exploit her deepest fears and insecurities, that Dorothy found herself questioning her own judgment. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe Marcus really had been trying to help in his clumsy way. Maybe her suspicions were symptoms of the paranoia that sometimes accompanied aging.
But then she remembered the careful highlighting on her copied documents, the systematic nature of the violation, the smooth lies Amber had told without hesitation. This wasn't the bumbling helpfulness of a concerned son. This was the calculated manipulation of someone who viewed her as a resource to be exploited. "You have until Friday evening," Dorothy said, her voice stronger than she felt. "After that, I'm calling the police." Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "You'd really call the police on your own son over some paperwork?" "I'd call the police on anyone who stole my personal information and lied to me about it." "Fine," Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge Dorothy had never heard before. "But don't come crying to us when you realize what a mistake you're making. When you're sitting here all alone, dealing with your problems by yourself, remember that you chose this." The threat was clear: comply or face abandonment. It was emotional blackmail of the most sophisticated kind, designed to exploit every fear Dorothy had about aging and isolation. But instead of crumbling under the assault, Dorothy felt something unexpected: relief. She finally saw Marcus clearly, without the filter of maternal love and wishful thinking. He wasn't a struggling son in need of temporary help. He was a predator who had identified her as an easy mark. "I'll take that risk," Dorothy said quietly. As Marcus stormed out of the kitchen, Dorothy sat alone with the weight of what had just transpired. She'd just ordered her only child out of her home, potentially severing their relationship forever. The magnitude of the decision should have devastated her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days: peace. Friday couldn't come soon enough. Dorothy had found her backbone, and she intended to use it. The woman who had welcomed Marcus and Amber with open arms just 5 days ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more protective of what mattered most: her dignity, her security, and her right to live peacefully in her own home. The temporary arrangement was about to become permanently over, and Dorothy had never been more certain of anything in her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.